The night of my grandfather's 75th birthday began with champagne, violin music, and the kind of expensive smiles people wear when they want everyone to believe a family is perfect. But I knew better because for 23 years, I had been treated like an unwanted guest in my own home. My name is Nora Bennett, and while my relatives gathered beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Hawthorne Manor ballroom, I stood near the entrance holding an old leather handbag that had belonged to my father, unaware that within a few hours the family secrets everyone had worked so hard to bury would finally come into the light. I had been raised by my Aunt Meredith after my parents died in a winter highway accident when I was 6, and although she always reminded everyone that she had opened her home to me, she never mentioned that my father had left behind a substantial inheritance intended specifically for my future. Her children, Caleb and Sophie, received private schools, new cars, expensive vacations, and bedrooms decorated like magazine spreads, while I slept in a converted storage room and learned to accept second-hand clothes with a smile, because complaining only gave Meredith another reason to call me ungrateful. For years, I believed the money my parents had left was gone because Meredith told me there had been barely enough to cover their funeral expenses, and whenever I asked whether my father had left paperwork or accounts behind, she would sigh dramatically and say, "Nora, some things are better forgotten when you're lucky enough to have a roof over your head." I eventually stopped asking questions, worked part-time jobs through college, paid my own tuition, and built a quiet life as an emergency room nurse, convincing myself that independence mattered more than knowing why my childhood had always felt like something I had to apologize for. The one person who never treated me like an inconvenience was my grandfather, Arthur Bennett, who lived across town in a modest house surrounded by maple trees and always kept a spare key hidden beneath the blue flower pot beside his porch. He noticed everything Meredith tried to hide, from the way my school books were older than Caleb's toys to the fact that I stopped wearing the necklace my mother had given me, and whenever I visited him he would make tea, listen without interrupting, and tell me, "Your parents didn't leave you behind, Nora. Someone simply wants you to believe they did." When Arthur's birthday invitation arrived, Meredith warned me that the celebration was going to be very formal and suggested I avoid embarrassing the family by dressing too simply. But I arrived wearing my mother's emerald scarf, a dark green dress, and the same calm expression I had learned to wear whenever someone tried to make me feel small. At first everything seemed pleasant, until Meredith looked at the seating chart, frowned theatrically, and announced loud enough for half the room to hear, "Oh dear, Nora, there must have been a mistake because that chair is reserved for immediate family, but I'm sure you won't mind sitting with the staff for dinner." A few relatives laughed nervously, Caleb smirked into his glass, and Sophie immediately raised her phone as though she had been waiting for the perfect moment to record my humiliation. But instead of arguing, I simply picked up my handbag and walked toward the small side table near the service entrance, where the restaurant manager quietly apologized for the confusion. I could have cried, shouted, or walked away, yet something about Meredith's confidence made me suspicious, because people rarely behave that boldly unless they believe they are completely protected from consequences. 20 minutes later, while I was sitting alone with a glass of water, I overheard Caleb whispering to Sophie near the hallway, and although they lowered their voices when they noticed me, I caught enough to understand that my exclusion had never been about seating. "Once she signs those papers tonight, Dad can finally close the account," Caleb said, while Sophie answered, "She won't question anything if Mom keeps pretending Grandpa is confused." And suddenly the strange behavior of the entire evening made sense, because they were not trying to humiliate me for fun. They were trying to keep me away from Arthur before something happened. I immediately went looking for my grandfather and found him standing inside the library with a silver-haired woman I had never seen before, while beside them sat a tall man carrying a black document case and wearing the serious expression of someone who had come prepared for an argument. Arthur smiled when he saw me and said, "Nora, there you are. I was beginning to wonder how long it would take them to realize that the person they pushed away is the person I invited here for a reason." And the woman beside him introduced herself as Evelyn Price, an estate attorney who had represented Arthur for more than a decade. Evelyn explained that Arthur had discovered something disturbing months earlier while reviewing old financial records, and she placed several documents across the desk, showing that an investment account established by my father had never disappeared at all, but had been quietly transferred between accounts controlled by Meredith and her husband shortly after my parents died. The account had started with $450,000, had grown through investments over the years, and according to the records now, contained considerably more than the original amount, meaning that the childhood I had been told to accept as charity had actually been funded by money that legally belonged to me. Arthur then revealed the part Meredith had never expected him to discover. My father had written a letter instructing Arthur to protect my inheritance until I reached adulthood, and because Arthur had been unable to access the account without triggering a complicated legal dispute at the time, he had spent years quietly collecting evidence instead of confronting Meredith without proof. "I wanted to protect you from another broken promise," he told me, "so I waited until I could put the truth in your hands instead of simply putting anger in your heart. And for the first time in my life, I realized that his silence had never meant he believed Meredith. It meant he had been building a case." When Arthur returned to the ballroom, he asked everyone to remain seated, and the birthday celebration instantly became silent as Evelyn placed copies of the financial records in front of Meredith and her husband, while Arthur calmly explained that the account had been transferred back into my name that morning along with the accumulated earnings. Meredith's expression changed from confusion to panic, and when she demanded to know why Arthur would believe a spoiled adult child over his own daughter, he answered, "Because numbers do not have favorites, signatures do not forget." And 23 years of records are much harder to manipulate than one family dinner. Confrontation that followed was quieter than I expected, because Meredith stopped shouting when Evelyn explained that the documents would be submitted to the appropriate authorities, and that every unauthorized withdrawal had been carefully documented, while her husband finally admitted that he had known about the account, but convinced himself that using the money for the family was justified. Caleb tried to blame his mother. Sophie insisted she had known nothing, and Meredith called me selfish for destroying the family. But I finally looked directly at her and said, "You didn't lose a family tonight. You lost control over someone you spent years teaching not to ask questions." The legal process lasted months, and although the money could not erase the childhood I had lost, the investigation confirmed the financial misconduct and resulted in restitution agreements, penalties, and the recovery of many assets that Meredith had believed were permanently hidden. I also learned that several relatives who had laughed at me that evening had known pieces of the truth, and instead of begging them to apologize, I quietly stopped answering their calls because sometimes healing begins when you stop waiting for people who benefited from your silence to suddenly understand your pain. Arthur lived long enough to see me establish a small educational fund for young people who had lost parents and were struggling to pay for college. And when I showed him the first scholarship certificate bearing my parents' names, he smiled and said, "That is what your father would have wanted you to do with a second chance." I kept my nursing job, moved into a small apartment filled with plants and sunlight, framed my parents' photograph above the bookshelf, and whenever I passed the old Hawthorne Manor, I no longer remembered the chair they refused to give me, because I had finally learned that belonging is not something other people get to grant or take away. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.